Hello and welcome to the Friday Five on December 9th, 2022. Thanks for joining me for this live stream. If you are new to this broadcast, this is part of a larger program called the Montessori Masterclass, where I work with families and an international team of Montessori educators who are showing up for families to actually coach and guide you through your child's most important years of development, all the way from prenatal through the age of 6. We will help guide you and walk you through movement, play, sleep, solids, walking, toddlerhood, tantrums, literacy, preschool development, all of that. We're going to help walk you through it in the Montessori Masterclass, where we do self-study lessons. We have a podcast, we have weekly live groups, and this live stream for you to submit your questions every Friday so that they can be addressed by a Montessori trained teacher and for you to get the kind of developmental information you might be looking for. And the Friday Five consists of 5 key parts where I talk about a Montessori toy versus a conventional toy. So we talk about some similarities and some differences of what we mean by Montessori in terms of the Montessori materials. We're going to then think of a practical life idea, so something in daily living for the child and how to incorporate the child into that. We cover a children's book. And lastly, I tackle a parenting question that I find on the internet. And if you're joining me live, please feel free to pop your questions into the chat and I will answer them as we go. So let's get into it, the Friday Five. So we're going to do our Montessori toy versus non-Montessori toy, and it's actually going to be the same category of toys today. We're going to talk about dolls. So we're going to try to think about this through the lens of development, but we also need to think about this through the lens of culture. So, because of course, dolls are human representations. So we need to think about human culture as well as the child's inherent development. So before we get specifically into dolls, we're going to think more broadly about what makes a Montessori toy a Montessori toy. And when we say Montessori, there's a couple of ideas that can come up. One is that the things that we provide the child to use in their environment, those are meant to center their development by allowing them to do the development that they're trying to do. For example, if the child we know around 3 months is working on grasping, well, it sure would make sense if we gave them things that they were within their reach that they could grasp, rather than a handheld toy that's on the floor that they can't roll over and grab. So we align the child's experiences to their development so that that development can flourish. Conventional toys are most often designed for entertainment. So keeping the child busy and occupied. That is sort of the bar of what is a good toy. So sometimes there is some developmental alignment, but oftentimes, because that's the focus, we get pretty misaligned to the child's development, and the child ends up in this sort of negative feedback loop of, I wait to be entertained by the environment, so therefore I don't go into the environment to find interesting things to do. Therefore, I find myself being bored a lot. And later on, that looks like the child nagging and sort of clinging and wanting to kind of constantly have the adult's attention, whereas the Montessori approach is so much about allowing the child's inner zest for life and learning to be fostered so that the child is able to constantly go out into their environment, do new things. And so that's what they do. When they don't have anything to do, they go find it. And so you see a lot more independent play. You see kids exploring. You see, all of that stuff rather than the waiting and being entertained and then being in a cycle of boredom and then needing more entertainment. So that's what we mean by a Montessori versus a conventional toy. Often it comes down to the development versus if the intent is entertainment. Now, with dolls, there's going to be a couple of layers to this. And I want to make sure to address the cultural aspect because these are human representations. So just like when we're having the child engage with other animal representations, like a hippopotamus or a cheetah or, a stuffed animal of a lion, whatever it is, there are different variations of realness of any of those. There's the stuffed animal, very cartoony. And then there's all the way to like a real replica where a lion really looks like a lion. Of course, it's not a real lion, but it looks very much like a lion. So it sort of depends on what the intent of this is. If we're intending to use the object as a way to talk about that animal, it is going to be hard to do that if the child is just building their language and they don't have a stable definition or sense of what things are and what representations of those things would look like. So if the child doesn't have any orientation to what a lion is, they don't know the word, they don't know the animal, there's no information, and then we use a very cartoony stuffed animal to talk to them about the lion, then they're probably going to get some misinformation about what to expect from what a lion is, as opposed to a very concrete replica. That's definitely not an experience with a lion, but at least the parts of the lion and the proportions are all relatively correct for me to be able to talk about it. So the same thing is true with dolls. So the first sort of line of dolls is if we're actually going to use the doll to talk about body parts, to talk about the cheeks and the hands, and we're going to bathe the baby doll and all that, it would make sense to have the doll have genitalia, which a lot of times dolls don't. So in Montessori, it's most often that if you are going to have a doll and you're using it for language, it's going to follow the same line of thinking as the lion replica versus the cartoon stuffed animal. That would make the most sense, is to have the baby not sort of be absent this one very normal, very natural part of everyone's bodies that doll manufacturers sometimes often will remove. And it's a private area. So it's something that, we do keep private and share with only people that we trust. And so sometimes people have a hard time talking about it, but the child doesn't have any of that baggage. And if they're able to look at their own body and then they see dolls who never, ever, ever have genitalia, it can be kind of confusing. So if we're going to use the doll for language, it would make sense and be more aligned to the construction of language, the development of language for that doll to be a more accurate representation of a human form, just like we would look for an accurate representation of a lion form. But that's not the only reason we have these things, right? Sometimes children will use, especially in like toddler or preschool youth, they will use things like stuffed animals beyond just understanding language, that they're using it for, something comfortable. It's squishy. They like to engage with it in a way that it's not hard plastic. Like they like to have it in their beds because it's not uncomfortable to be near. And so in that sense, because we're not using it as this sort of important part of language for the child, that the more sort of cartoony versions of things are completely fine. That makes a lot of sense. So when you're thinking about dolls that are less realistic and dolls that are more realistic, it sort of depends on the intent of the child's experience. So if the child is interested in doing things like in Montessori, sometimes we do baby doll bathing where the child has a little tub, and some kids really enjoy this activity where they have a little scrub brush and they like to clean the baby doll. I would use the phrasing baby doll so that they don't get the impression that they actually have been given a lesson or know how to clean a baby because they haven't. but they do really enjoy that. And so if they're trying to engage in a very language driven way, it makes sense for that to be very sort of representative of a human form. But then when you get to the dolls that are less realistic, I think there's a couple of things to think about when it comes to human culture. So, because these are representations, we have to call into question who's making the representations? Who are the doll manufacturers? Who are deciding what it looks like to have human eyes? What does it look like for this particular doll? What kind of fabric color are we going to use for the doll's skin? What kind of clothing is being chosen? What kind of hair is being chosen? So, all of those things, I think that if you look up dolls, by and large, we're going to see a lot of sort of white European features and culture being centered, which is um, something that we want to pay attention to because it's often not representative of the human experience. So when we think about dolls, it's really important to not just take a doll manufacturer and get like multiple different sort of uh, types of dolls or backgrounds of dolls, so that you have diversity in your doll collection, because you still have probably a white centered manufacturer making all of those dolls, which means that they're including a lot of bias in terms of how that each of those dolls are going to be represented. So to really actually share with the child the diversity of the human experience, seek out doll manufacturers from different cultural backgrounds and have a variety of dolls in terms of style, in terms of shape, in terms of texture, in terms of clothing, in terms of hairstyle, so that the child, your child, who's playing with dolls, has the actual opportunity to engage with different dolls from different places, and they get that human element of dolls, as opposed to getting one manufacturer's line of 8 different dolls from different backgrounds, different cultural, racial, or ethnic backgrounds. Number one, they're probably getting a lot of that from stereotypes of those sort of ethnic groups or racial groups. And there's an opportunity to not only support alternate doll manufacturers, but to actually have the dolls that the child is playing with be actually diverse. That some of them are plastic based and some of them are fabric based and some of them are a mix between the two. That would be a very affirming way for the child to tap into the diverseness and the celebration of the sort of more broad human experience. So when we think about dolls and we think about the child's development, we definitely want to think through language development. We want to give the child a real impression of the body. This is also true with things like Barbie dolls, where their feet are always up like this, as if they're in high heels, which some Barbie dolls you can find flat footed. But still, there's quite a lot on the market where the foot, that's not what the foot looks like. And the proportions of a lot of those kinds of dolls are wrong. And there's a sort of curvy line of Barbie dolls. There's other doll companies who've made dolls that are the size of Barbie dolls, but they're meant to be more sort of normal, normal height, weight. But what is normal? What is average, right? We can't just go from one company and say this is going to fit all affinities and groups and cultures. So that's why I think having both the language approach by making sure the dolls are realistic in some cases, and then also having dolls from different manufacturers where those manufacturers actually authentically represent different cultures. That would be a really lovely experience and opportunity to talk to the child about diversity, to talk to the child about differences, and to celebrate those differences in the first 3 years. So it's beyond just realistic dolls. It's actually broader than that, because this is meant to be a representation of the human experience or human culture. And so we want to think about all the different cultures that are a part of the experience of our species when we think about dolls. The other thing to think about is it's not usually characterized as dolls, but there's often figurines that are attached to certain toys. And those also center white figurine characters and center sort of white cultural experiences. So things like Legos, the sort of default Lego, all of the Legos tend to be this sort of representation of a white person. But there are companies that actually change that. So if you're looking for figurines to offset, first tell the company that they need to offer a more variety of skin color, hair color, dress. Then also seek out manufacturers, because there are some who will provide you with different people representation. So there's a company that will give you Lego hands and heads, and I believe hair, that is of a variety of different skin tones and hair types. So those kinds of things make a big difference to the child. They are in a stage of absorbent mind, they're in a stage of embodied memory, and the time that we tend to see the child starting to make racially discriminatory behavior is around 3 years old. That's when we start to see it. That's not when it shows up as the idea in the child's head. It's based on 3 years of information that they've had that have told them to often center whiteness, and that can be seen in, look at your books. How many books are representing white characters or by white authors or have white illustrators? Look at the toys. How many dolls or figurines are represented who are white? How many of the characters, whether in books, in figurines, or in other toys, do you have that were actually created by a manufacturer whose bread and butter is like white sort of figurines and dolls that they've just added on a few other SKUs, which means that there's a bias, often based on stereotypes, that are creating those culturally different SKUs. That's as opposed to finding authors and illustrators from all different kinds of backgrounds who are creating lovely and amazing children's books. Follow the group We Need Diverse Books. That's a great place. They're on social media. They have a website. They have a great place for you to find books that are authentically representing different communities and different cultures for children by really, really well done children's authors. So, and when you look for any figurine, whether it's a doll, a Lego set, look for that diversity so that the child's experience is diverse in a celebratory way of different communities, different cultures, so that by the time they're 3, they have not absorbed, or we've at least limited the absorption of the white centeredness as the norm. And then we see children acting on that, as in racially discriminatory behavior that we see in preschool. So those are dolls. The other thing about dolls is it tends to be a fun activity for kids. They like to reenact the day-to-day of caregivers or adults that they see in their lives. Some kids are more interested in dolls than others, but it tends to be a very popular thing for toddlers and up to engage with. Infants don't necessarily have the same orientation to something like this. And it can be a really lovely way to support the child's independent play and allow them to engage in some of those reenactments that they really like to do, of imagining, they're the bus driver and then picking up the people. So sometimes imagination in Montessori gets a little bit confused. And what I'll say briefly about that is in Montessori, we always follow the child. So what we see that the child naturally gravitates toward is reenactments of real life. We don't stop that. We don't say, oh, there's no real bus, so therefore you shouldn't do it because I'm trying to do Montessori. No, the child is allowed. They have the freedom to move, the freedom to choose, and the freedom to talk. But what we do see is they like to reenact, to imagine real life scenarios. They only imagine fantastical scenarios when we have inserted that into their experience. So if we've inserted fantastical things, then they do tend to play those things. But that's because we've inserted them. So the argument is that we would be curbing their natural creativity by inserting things that we think kids might be interested in, like fairies and dragons and other fantastical things. When if we don't do that, we still see children imagine and pretend, but they're pretending real life, which is why we give them real life, because it's observable in children that without our inserting anything, the child is still following the path towards reality, because that's ultimately what is going to serve them. All right, so let's get into our practical life. So we've done 2 out of 3 practical life. Today we're talking about vacuuming. So this is just a really interesting topic. So when we think about the child cleaning up, and if you follow Montessori or trying to do Montessori at home, you might think about, having a brush and dustpan or a broom. And that might be applicable in some homes, and it just might not be as applicable in other homes. So other homes that have carpet might not use a broom or a brush and dustpan that often, because it's harder to clean. You can't sweep the rug as easily, especially if it's got a high pile. So how do you clean that? Oh, well, you use some kind of vacuum, or there's some way of cleaning the rug that is not necessarily with that particular tool. So if a child is in a home that has carpets, whatever the family does to clean the home, that's what the child wants to do. And that's what we need to think about, giving them access to a child-sized version. So it's not to say that all children should have brooms, because you've seen that on Pinterest. It's to say that the child should have access, especially in toddlerhood, to cleaning materials that match the kind of cleaning that you do in your home. So if you use a vacuum in your home, the child is going to be much more interested in using a vacuum. It might be more of a longer term investment to get a smaller vacuum, like a dustbuster, for the child to vacuum and support, because that's something that you can use in lots of other places, as opposed to getting like an actual child-sized vacuum. That might not be worth your time or money, because that is going to be challenging for the child as they get older and the vacuum no longer fits them. Whereas something that is already small, like a dustbuster, that's something that a younger child can use, and it's fully applicable later in life. But basically, once you've decided on the tool that you want to use, the child isn't going to know how to use it. So if I had to, fix something in my car and I'm not familiar with how to fix that, I would need if I'm going to be the one to fix it, then I'm going to need somebody to teach me how to do that. And it doesn't help me if they just do it. I actually have to do it myself with their coaching. So that's where a lesson would come in. So this would be a kind of tool that a child would need a lesson on. And they would need a lesson on a variety of different things. So how do you turn it on? And how do you turn it off? That could be one lesson. Even outside of vacuuming, you could just show them, here's the button to turn on, and you push the button again to turn it off. And then you give them a turn, and they practice turning it on. And then you say, oh, try turning it off. That could be the very first lesson. And then the next lesson could be, now that they already know how to turn it on, it could be about noticing something, like if there's sand on the floor, noticing something that's relatively easy to clean up, showing them how to turn it on, cleaning up some of it, turning it off, and giving them a turn. So we want to think about these tools as things that we have to scaffold and introduce the child to. But once they learn how to do it, then it's actually helpful for us. Because if my job is to vacuum part of the home, it would actually go faster if my child was using the dustbuster to clean up the baseboards. That'd be amazing. So too often we look to toys to entertain the child, especially in toddlerhood, so that we can do other things. And practical life is about breaking down that barrier and say, actually, you doing this with me helps both of us, but it wouldn't help if the child wasn't helpful, which is why we have to give them the scaffolded lessons, so that it's actually part of help. And then we can appreciate them. And then as they get older, they can use the larger vacuum and actually help you out. And you could say, "Hey, could you vacuum the carpet by the couch?" And they could. And it's really, really helpful. So that is vacuuming. Um, Clearly, we need to have a walking child to be able to use this. So, in terms of age, this is not going to be something for babies. This would be something for a steady footed toddler. So, somebody who's no longer crawling, they've chosen walking, they're upright. That would be a great time to introduce a vacuum if you have carpets in your home, and then they can use it from then on. All right, we're now 3 down, 2 to go. We're going to talk about our book. So, this book is going to be a great book for preschool. This is going to be a book that it sort of recommends between 4 and 8 years old. It's called Something Happened in Our Town, and it is a child's story about racial injustice. And it sort of follows 2 characters and 2 impressions of a officer shooting a black man. And so that's the news report. That was something happened in our town. That's something that happened. It's a white officer shot a black man. And there's 2 families that sort of there's 2 children trying to understand the story. This is not a story that I would read in the first 3 years. We want to start with joy. We want to start with affirmations. We want to start with cultural diversity that is authentic. We want to start with all of these wonderful things that we talked about when we were talking about dolls that really allow the child to celebrate the vastness of authentic diversity. So coming from the various cultures and groups to be able to represent themselves, and to do that in children's book, in media, and if you're fortunate enough to live in a diverse community, to get out into your community and make that just sort of a normal part of the child's experience. This book would be great. There's sort of a series of 3 that I would highly recommend. The first is All the Colors We Are. It's a story that tells you why skin color is different. That's a great book to start with around 3. That just gives language to actually what's going on that changes the pigment in people's skin. Then after that, there's a book called Race Cars that we talked about last week. It's a story of white privilege. I think that's a great book to go after All the Colors We Are. Sometime around 4, that would be great. And really start talking particularly for white children to actually really understand what is meant by white privilege, and the lack of obstacles that are being put in the path. And it's told in a way that's very developmentally appropriate, and it doesn't try to explain 400 years of structural racism and bias and how that's influenced all different areas of our lives today. But it does give a very concrete, age-appropriate explanation of the lack of obstacles that are put in folks who are deemed as white people's paths, that are put in other people's paths, particularly people who are Black and Indigenous. But this story focuses on the sort of Black car, and the sort of an example of a person who's Black's experience, an example of a person who's white is experience. So that particular book is a really helpful one to come out of after a lot of affirming talk around why skin color is different, and then getting to Something Happened in Our Town. This was a really great way to actually address things that the child might hear about as they are 4, 5. They start understanding things that are coming on in the news or in the media, or what people are talking about at school. And it's really helpful to be able to walk them through that. This book also, I believe it was written by 3 psychologists, but it also has some really, really, really helpful definitions in the back of the book, and really helpful guiding questions to have with your child. So all around, it's a really great guided reading that will help guide you in having conversations with your child. So Something Happened in Our Town. And our last one is about outdoor toys. So this is our parent question. So I answer one parent question a week. And if you're joining me live, you can pop your questions in the chat. And the question is, what are the best toys or equipment for outdoor playtime? And I think that there's a couple things that I would say. One is that we talk about something called the prepared environment a lot in Montessori. And the prepared environment is not a classroom. It's not the corner of your living room with the toys in it. It's the idea is that whatever space the child's in, whether it be a car or the living room or the bedroom or out in the forest, we can take into account their development in the experience that they're having. And if we can prepare the environment for their developmental success, then they're going to meet their potential. And ideally, we are doing that in all the spaces the child is. And sometimes we are more limited in terms of what the child's developmental offerings will be. We cannot prepare the space as much. And there's other times where we can prepare it a lot. So when we think about the outdoor environment, it's still a prepared environment. I'm going to give you an example to share what I mean by that. In a forest, there are a ton of really amazing opportunities for the child's development. There's the opportunity to move towards sounds, there's the opportunity to explore. There's so many opportunities for sensory input from the sights, the smells, all of that. So it's a great space for the child to be able to develop. And if we imagine a 3-month-old, if I just put them on the forest floor, they probably are going to be rather uncomfortable. So, are they going to be able to realize and access the developmental opportunities in the space? Probably not, because I'm going to have to pick them up. And now, yes, they can still have some sensory input, but they don't have as much motor freedom to actually move towards things that are interesting to them because I'm picking them up. So I could prepare the environment by putting a mat down or a cloth or something so that when I lay the child down, it's not uncomfortable and they can lay down and actually move their body and reach that developmental potential. So that's the same idea, is that whenever we think about the outdoors, there's not certain things that you need to have a sort of outdoor toys, but we want to think, is the space prepared for the child's development? So that begs the question, well, what are they developing? So in the first 3 years, primarily, they are focused on walking and talking. They are looking to move and they are looking to talk. So in the outdoor environment, does the child have the opportunity to freely move around that space? And if they don't, why not? So if the child does not have the freedom to move around that space, the question is, well, could they? And what do we need to remove or what do we need to add in order for the child to explore the space? We might also think about the materials that are out there. Like, is the child accessing like a forest where there's tons of things? There's a creek and there's sticks and there's tons of things for them to use as equipment to construct themselves? Or is it a paved, 4 square kind of space where there's not much to move towards or move with or put together, in which case we might want to add a few things to the child's experience. They tend to enjoy water, whether they're indoors or outdoors, but I think families tend to be more amenable to water use outside. So I would think about things like water-based watercolor painting, or even just painting the fence with a watered brush, or watering the garden, or adding some plants to water. Anything that involves water can be something that inspires movement. And then having just sort of a complex array of things that have different words. So to inspire their language is to aid them and provide them with a variety of things that they could possibly talk about. So things like outdoor chalk tends to be interesting to children. Digging tends to be inspiring them, that we tend to not want them to do at home and inside. So that could be digging in sand in some capacity. There could be digging in dirt. Of course, they would need tools for that. So we want tools that actually work. But the idea is that we're just trying to say, well, what is the child's movements and how do I allow them to do more of that? And then we prepare the environment to the best of our ability and we allow the child to be there. And then we see, well, what did we prepare that we're missing? The child really, really, really wants to jump. And there's not like a ton of jumping aside from just jumping on the floor. So is there a possibility of adding something around jumping, whether it's a log that they can jump off of and jump onto? Or do they want a balance thing with stepping stones or cut rounds of a tree? What is going to help the child do the kind of movements that they want to do? I don't think that you need to get like expensive equipment. You don't need to sort of put together a big mud kitchen. It's really, really basic about saying, is the child prepared for the kind of movement? Is the environment prepared for the kind of movements my child wants to be doing? And things like basic art, and then things like digging, washing is very applicable outside, and other things that would be practical for the outdoors. Can they grow tomatoes and then take care of the tomatoes? What would be practical for the child to be able to do outside, and then allowing them to do it and allowing them to explore. So this is the same indoors and out. This is not curated, not indoors, not outdoors. It's a prepared environment that we give the child freedom within some very basic limits to be able to meet the development that they are trying to do. And that's the end of our Friday Five. I thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time where we will talk about one Montessori toy, one conventional toy, one practical life idea, one children's book, and one parent question that I find on the internet. Thanks for watching and hope to see you in the Montessori Masterclass.